It was 5 in the morning on the 15th of August in the year 1231 when the first columns of dust appeared on the horizon. From the walls of the Kuju fortress, the sentries watched in horror as the dust turned into a dark tide covering the plain. As far as the eye could see, 20,000 Mongol horsemen were advancing toward them. General Park Seo climbed the main tower and counted his forces. 300 soldiers, some armed peasants with whatever they had found. Terrified women and children sheltering as refugees inside the walls. That was all he had to defend Kuju against the deadliest army the world had ever known. The Mongols knew no defeat. In 1231, under Gedai Khan, they had conquered more territory in 25 years than the Roman Empire in 400 years. China had fallen after decades of resistance. Persia, with its millennial fortified cities, had been swept off the map. Baghdad, Samarkand, Bukhara, names that once inspired respect, now just ashes and memories. Their strategy was brutal and effective. They arrived, demanded immediate surrender, and if the answer was no, they razed everything. In no negotiation, no mercy, only two options: submit or die. General Sartak, commander of the Mongol forces in Korea, had an impeccable record. He had taken 15 fortresses in the last 3 months. None had resisted more than 2 days. Kuju would be number 16, and everyone knew it. When Sartak sent his envoy demanding surrender, Park Seo gave a response that stunned the Mongol. "Tell your general to come and take what he can. We will not abandon these walls alive." It was a death sentence, military suicide, absolute madness. 300 men against 20,000 of the most feared warriors on the planet. But Park Seo had a plan, tactics. The Mongols had never faced, and something more dangerous than any weapon. Men who had decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees, to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. We must understand what the Mongol Empire really was in 1231. We are not talking about an ordinary army, but the most devastating military force that had ever set foot on Earth until then. Genghis Khan had died 4 years earlier in 1227, but his legacy was more alive than ever. His son Gedai Khan had assumed the throne of the largest empire the world had seen. In just 25 years, the Mongols had conquered territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, more than 24 million square kilometers under a single banner. The Roman Empire at its peak took 400 years to conquer, 5 million kilometers. Every Mongol soldier was an elite rider trained from the age of 3. They could fire arrows with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. They could cover 150 kilometers in a single day, when other armies barely managed 30. But their deadliest weapon was not military. It was psychological terror. When the Mongols approached a city, they sent envoys with a simple message: surrender now and live as subjects, or resist and be exterminated to the last man, woman, and child. It was not an empty threat. They always fulfilled it. Samarkand, one of the most beautiful cities in Persia, made the mistake of resisting in 1220. It had 100,000 inhabitants. When the Mongols finished, fewer than 50,000 remained. In 1231, this destruction machine had set its eyes on the Korean peninsula. The kingdom of Goryeo, which had existed for almost 300 years, was the next target. Gedai Khan sent one of his best generals for the campaign, Sartak. He was a veteran of the Chinese campaigns where he had participated in the siege of fortresses considered impregnable. He arrived in Korea with 20,000 of the empire's best horsemen. In the first 3 months of the campaign, Sartak had taken 15 fortresses. Some surrendered without fighting. Others resisted 1 or 2 days before the walls were overcome. The average was 36 hours per fortress. The kingdom of Goryeo was on the verge of collapse. The king had fled to Ganghwa Island, abandoning the mainland territory. City after city fell. Resistance seemed useless. The Mongols were unstoppable, and then they reached Kuju. Park Seo was a middle-aged general, approximately 45 years old when the siege began. He did not come from a particularly powerful noble family. He had risen in the military ranks by his own merit, fighting in border skirmishes against bandits and pirates. What made him different was his mind. Park Seo was an obsessive scholar of war. While other generals relied on traditional tactics, he read ancient military treatises, experimented with new formations, designed innovative siege weapons. His superiors often considered him eccentric, too theoretical, impractical. The Mongols invaded. Park received the order to defend Kuju with the available forces. It was not an order for victory, but an order to delay the inevitable. No one expected him to resist more than a day or two. Park counted his resources. 300 trained soldiers, some veterans of minor skirmishes, but none had ever faced a real siege, much less against the Mongols. In addition, he had inside the walls approximately 2,000 civilians, peasants who had fled from surrounding villages seeking protection. The walls of Kuju were 8 meters high, built in stone more than a century ago, solid, but not exceptional. He had enough stored food for perhaps 3 weeks, if strictly rationed. Water came from a well inside the fortress, which was an advantage but limited. In terms of armament, the situation was precarious. Bows, arrows, some crossbows, swords, spears, nothing special. The Mongols had battering rams, catapults, siege towers, equipment that had brought down fortresses 10 times larger than Kuju. Any rational commander would have evaluated the situation and reached the obvious conclusion: defense was impossible. Surrender was the only logical option to save lives. Park Seo reached a different conclusion. He gathered his officers the night before the Mongols arrived and told them something recorded in the Korean Chronicles. Tomorrow we will see if 20,000 men who believe they have already won can defeat 300 who know they have nothing to lose. It was not bravado, but cold calculation. Park understood something fundamental about the Mongols. Their greatest strength was also their weakness. They were accustomed to winning quickly. Their strategy depended on speed and terror. It happened when they encountered resistance that did not break. What happened when terror did not work? He was about to find out. On the 16th of August, 1231. At dawn, the 20,000 Mongol horsemen completely surrounded the Kuju fortress. Sardek ordered the Mongol standards planted 300 meters from the walls. It was a clear message. This was Mongol territory now. The first Mongol tactic was not military but psychological. Throughout the first day, the horsemen simply circled the fortress, galloping in circles, shouting, banging their swords on their shields. The noise was deafening and constant. The dust raised by the horses covered the sky. It was a display of power designed to break morale before the first attack. Inside the walls, panic was palpable. Civilians cried. Some begged Park Seo to surrender, to negotiate, to do something to stop what was coming. Park ordered silence. He gathered everyone in the central courtyard and spoke to them bluntly. The Mongols expect us to be afraid. They expect us to surrender. What they do not know is that we have already made our decision. We will not leave here alive if we fall, so we will make every hour they spend trying to take us cost them blood. We will make them remember this place. It was not an inspiring speech full of promises of victory. It was realistic, brutal, honest, and strangely that calmed some. If they were going to die, at least it would be with dignity. On the second day, Sartek sent another envoy. This time the offer had changed. Surrender, and we will only execute the military leaders. The civilians will live. It was a generous offer by Mongol standards. Park Seo did not even respond, simply sent the envoy back empty-handed. Sartek understood the message. There would be no negotiation. He ordered preparations for the siege to begin. While Park watched from the main tower, he saw them begin to build battering rams, mobile siege towers, and catapults. But Park had also been preparing. Before the Mongols arrived, he had implemented modifications to the defenses that his officers considered strange, even unnecessary. Now those modifications began to make sense. First, he had ordered deep trenches dug just behind the main walls. If the Mongols managed a breach, they would find another unexpected obstacle. Second, he had built elevated wooden platforms behind the walls where archers could reposition quickly. Third, and most important, he had gathered all the oil, tar, and flammable materials in the region. Park divided his 300 soldiers into specialized groups: 100 archers, 80 spearmen to defend the walls in hand-to-hand combat, 60 men assigned to operate the special defenses he had designed, and the remaining 60 would be the mobile reserve. But his most valuable resource was not the soldiers, it was the civilians. Park did something no other commander had attempted before. He armed the civilian population not to fight but to sustain the war effort. Women were organized into production teams to constantly manufacture arrows. The elders took charge of rationing and distributing food and water. Children over 10 years old were assigned as messengers. Everyone had a function. No one was idle. Park also implemented something revolutionary for the time: rotating shifts. While other commanders kept all soldiers on the walls during attacks, exhausting them without rest. Park established that only 1/3 of his forces would be in defensive position at any given time. The other 2/3 rested, 8 recovered, 8. This meant his men would always be fresher than the enemy. On the 3rd day, Sartak completed his preparations. He had 3 battering rams built, 2 mobile siege towers, and 6 catapults positioned. He ordered one last message to Park SEO. Tomorrow at dawn, the attack begins. This is your last chance. Open the gates, or we will tear them down. Park gathered his commanders that night and showed them the plans he had been designing. They were tactics no one had used before because no one had needed to be so desperately creative. He explained how they would use boiling oil not only when the Mongols scaled but before, creating rivers of fire that would flow down the walls. He showed how he had modified the crossbows to fire multiple arrows simultaneously. He revealed that he had finished secret tunnels under certain sections of the wall, not to escape, but to collapse specific areas if the Mongols managed to position themselves there. One of his officers asked, "General, even with all this, how are we going to survive against 20,000? Park answered with brutal honesty, "We are not going to survive, but we are going to make them regret coming here." The 5th day dawned clear. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Sartak ordered the first total assault. 3,000 dismounted horsemen advanced toward the walls in close formation, protected by shields. Behind them, the battering rams began to move. Siege towers rolled slowly toward the walls. Park watched from his position. He did not give the order to fire. Not yet. The Mongols reached 100 meters from the walls, then 80, then 60. Their archers began to fire. At 30 meters, Park raised his hand. Now, 100 bows tensed and fired simultaneously. But they did not fire randomly. Park had trained his archers to aim at specific zones. The first 2 rows of Mongols fell instantly. Before they could react, a second wave of arrows hit them, then a third. Park had established a rotating firing rhythm. It was a constant flow of projectiles. The Mongols reached the walls and began to place ladders. The battering ram struck the main gates with a thunderous sound. It was then that Park activated his first surprise. He had ordered channels built at the top of the walls, channels that led downward across the entire stone surface. When the Mongols began to climb, he ordered boiling oil poured into those channels. The oil did not just fall on the climbers. It flowed across the entire wall like rivers of liquid fire. The screams of the burned Mongols were deafening. Men fell from the ladders, dragging others with them. But the Mongols did not retreat. They never retreated. They kept sending more men at the main gate. The battering ram kept pounding. The wood began to splinter. Park had anticipated this. Behind the main gate, he had built a second gate, reinforced with iron and stones. When the first gate finally gave way, after 2 hours of constant pounding, the Mongols found a solid wall. The siege towers finally reached the walls. From them, Mongol archers began firing directly at the defenders, killing 12 Korean soldiers in minutes. Park moved his reserve. 60 fresh men climbed the walls and attacked the towers with specially designed long spears. They did not try to destroy the towers, but to push them. With coordinated effort, the defenders managed to topple one of them. The Mongol archers inside fell screaming, crushed by their own structure. The first attack lasted for hours. Finally ordered the retreat, the Mongols left more than 200 corpses around the walls. The defenders had lost 23 men. It was a small victory, but a victory at last. For the first time, the Mongols had not taken a fortress in the first assault. But Park knew this was just beginning. On the 6th day, Sartek changed his strategy. It's no more massive frontal attacks. Instead, he implemented constant rotating attacks, sent groups of 500 men every 2 hours. The goal was not to take the fortress immediately, but to exhaust the defenders, not give them time to rest. It was devastating. Park's soldiers could not sleep, could not lower their guard. Every 2 hours, another wave of attackers for 3 consecutive days. By the 8th day, Park had lost 71 men. He had 229 operational soldiers left. The Mongols had lost approximately 800 but had 19,200 more. The math was brutal. That night, Park made a radical decision. He gathered his commanders and told them, "We will no longer defend the entire wall. We will concentrate on 3 key points. The rest we will abandon." His officers protested. Abandoning sections of the wall meant allowing the Mongols to establish positions. But Park had calculated everything. By concentrating his forces on 3 fortified points, he could implement real rotations. His men could sleep, could recover. And when the Mongols tried to exploit the abandoned sections, they would find the traps he had prepared. On the 9th day, the Mongols noticed that certain sections of the wall were unprotected. Sartek ordered a concentrated attack on those areas. 500 Mongols climbed without resistance. They thought they had finally achieved a breach. They entered directly into a trap. Park had mined those sections. When enough Mongols were inside, he detonated the rudimentary explosives he had prepared using gunpowder obtained from Chinese ceremonial rockets. The explosion collapsed part of the inner wall, trapping the Mongols among rubble. Those who survived found themselves in an enclosed space, surrounded by Korean archers in elevated positions. It was a massacre. Of the 500 who entered, only 50 managed to retreat. This was the psychological turning point. The Mongols began to doubt. For the first time in years, they faced an enemy that not only resisted, but outmaneuvered them tactically. Sartek was furious. He had lost more than 1,100 men in a week. He ordered more siege equipment brought from the base camp. During the 10th and 11th days, there was a relative pause. The Mongols bombarded constantly with catapults but launched no ground assaults. They were regrouping, preparing for something bigger. Park used this time wisely. He repaired the damaged walls, reorganized his defenses, and most important, spoke with his men. He reminded them why they fought. Every day they resisted was one more day the Mongols were not conquering another Korean city. On the 12th day, new Mongol siege equipment arrived. Sartek now had 10 catapults and 5 new battering rams. He had received reinforcements, 2,000 fresh soldiers to replace the casualties. The 13th day dawned with thunder in the distance. A storm was approaching, but it would not be the only violent thing that arrived. Sartek had decided to end this once and for all. He ordered 8,000 men to attack simultaneously from all flanks. At 7 in the morning, the most intense catapult bombardment up to that moment began. For 2 hours, barrel-sized projectiles rained on the fortress. Buildings collapsed. Then 8,000 Mongols attacked from all directions. The sound of their steps made the earth tremble. Park had 221 operational soldiers against 8,000. The math was impossible, but he was not thinking about math. He implemented the most radical tactic he had designed. Instead of distributing his men evenly across the walls, he concentrated 70% of his forces on a single point, the main gate. He left the rest of the walls practically unprotected. His officers thought he had lost his mind. But Park knew something they did not. The Mongols did exactly what he expected. Seeing the unprotected sections, they concentrated their forces. There, thousands of warriors scaled the eastern and southern walls with barely any resistance. In 30 minutes, they had control of a third of the fortifications. But then Park activated his plan. The sections the Mongols had taken did not lead directly to the interior of the fortress. Park had built secondary inner walls, creating a labyrinth of narrow quarters. The Mongols found themselves channeled into hallways barely 3 meters wide, where their superior numbers did not matter. And in those corridors, Park had positioned armed civilians on the roofs of adjacent buildings with simple instructions. Drop stones, wooden beams, boiling oil, anything heavy on the Mongols trapped below. It was a slaughter. The Mongols could not maneuver. They were trapped in tight spaces, being bombarded from above. The confusion was total. The Mongols began to retreat. But those coming behind kept pushing forward without knowing what was happening. At the main gate, where Park had concentrated his best troops, the 5 Mongol battering rams pounded simultaneously. The reinforced secondary gate began to give way. Park waited. When the gate finally broke, the Mongols burst in mass, shouting victory. They entered directly into a corridor of death. Park had built a funnel structure behind the gate. The Mongols who entered found themselves in a hallway. It's barely 5 meters wide, with Korean archers on elevated platforms on both sides. Arrows rained from impossible angles. It was a systematic slaughter. For 3 hours, the Mongols kept pushing, sending more men into that deadly funnel. The bodies of the fallen blocked the advance of the next. In the mid-afternoon, Sartak finally ordered the retreat. Could not believe it. He had sent 8,000 men. He had lost 1,000. The fortress still stood. The defenders had lost 47 soldiers and 89 civilians. Devastating numbers for such a small force, but they had survived the impossible. That night, Park did not sleep. He walked the walls, observed his exhausted, wounded, traumatized men. He had 174 soldiers left, approximately 1,800 civilians alive. Food supplies were running out. Arrows were scarce. He had used almost all his traps and improvised explosives. And the Mongols still had more than 16,000 men. Days 14 and 15 were relatively calm. The Mongols did not attack. They were reorganizing. On the 16th day, something changed. The Mongols began to build elevated platforms positioned out of reach of Korean arrows. On the 17th day, from those elevated positions, elite Mongol archers began a constant arrow bombardment. They were not trying to take the fortress. They were trying to make it impossible for the defenders to move. Any soldier who showed himself received a rain of arrows. It was the beginning of a true siege. For 5 days this continued. Park lost 15 men to Mongol snipers. One of them was his second in command, Captain Yi, hit in the neck while coordinating the defenses. Food was running out. Rations reduced to 1 small meal per day. Children cried from hunger. Elders began to die not from wounds, but from malnutrition and exhaustion. On the 22nd day, Park gathered his remaining officers. He told them the brutal truth. We have provisions for 3 days. After that, we will have to decide between surrendering or starving to death. One of the captains suggested a desperate night attack. That night, while preparing the plan, something unexpected happened. A Mongol soldier defected. He was a Korean who had been forced to join the Mongol army years earlier. He told Park something crucial. The Mongol camp was divided. Many officers questioned Sartak. They had lost more than 3,000 men in 3 weeks. Sartak was under pressure. He needed a quick victory or his reputation would be ruined. Park understood immediately. The Mongols were as desperate as he was, perhaps more. He made the boldest decision of the entire siege. Instead of an attack to escape, he would launch an attack to inflict maximum possible damage. On the 23rd day before dawn, Park selected his 50 best remaining warriors. They opened a small side gate. The Mongols did not guard so intensely. 50 men against a camp of thousands was absolute madness, but it worked. The Mongols did not expect an attack. The 50 Koreans entered like a knife into the camp, set fire to tents, destroyed supplies, killed dozens of sleeping Mongols, and before they could react, they retreated. They lost 12 men in the raid, but the psychological damage was immense. Sartak was humiliated, furious, desperate. The raid on the 23rd day had changed everything. Sartak called a war council. His officers presented 2 options: continue the siege or launch a final massive assault. Sartak chose the second option. Gedai Khan had already sent 3 messengers asking for progress. He ordered all available soldiers to participate in the next attack. 15,000 men in a simultaneous assault from all flanks. On the 24th day, the preparations began. Park had 162 operational soldiers. He gathered everyone in the central courtyard. He spoke to them without artifice. Tomorrow they will all come. Nothing will remain after this attack. It has been an honor to defend you. The 25th day dawned with a blood-red sky. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 15,000 Mongols attacked simultaneously. There was no prior bombardment, no psychological intimidation, just a human tsunami crashing against the walls from all directions. Ladders multiplied. The boiling oil ran out in the first hour. The arrows ran out in the second. Defenders began to fight with swords, spears, stones, anything. By noon, the Mongols had taken complete control of the eastern wall. Park took his final reserve, barely 30 men, and personally led the counterattack. At 45 years old, he fought like a possessed man. The Korean Chronicles record that he personally killed 7 Mongol warriors that day. He recovered the eastern wall, but lost 18 of his 30 men. The attack continued without pause for 14 hours. When the Mongols finally retreated at dusk, the walls looked like a slaughterhouse. There was blood everywhere, bodies piled on both sides. Park had lost 89 soldiers. He had 73 left. The Mongols had lost approximately 2,100 men. It was the worst slaughter of a single day in the entire siege. But the fortress still stood. Days 26 and 27 were of strange silence. The Mongols did not attack. They were exhausted, demoralized, confused. In the Mongol camp, the division was real. Officers openly questioned Sartak. Some suggested lifting the siege, but Sartak refused. His pride did not allow him to withdraw. On the 28th day, Mongol officers proposed poisoning the water. If they could not take the fortress by force, they would take it by slowly killing the defenders. The Mongols began throwing corpses of dead animals into the stream that fed Kuju's well. On the 29th day, the water inside the fortress began to have a strange smell. The situation was unsustainable. Without proper food, without clean water, with only 73 soldiers, Park knew they were in the final hours. On the 30th day, something unexpected happened. An envoy arrived at the Mongol camp from the king of Goryeo. The message was clear. The king had agreed to pay annual tribute to the Mongols and recognize their supremacy if they withdrew their forces. Gadai, tired of the Korean campaign, had accepted. The war had officially ended, but Sartak refused to lift the siege of Kuju. His personal honor was at stake. Days 31 and 32 were of tense negotiations. The royal envoy insisted that the siege must be lifted immediately. Sartak demanded only 2 more days to take Kuju. Inside the fortress, Park knew nothing of this. He only saw that the attacks had ceased. He thought the Mongols were preparing an even greater final assault. The 33rd day dawned with thick fog. Park and his men were on the walls, waiting for the attack they believed inevitable. But it did not come. Instead, at 10 o'clock in the morning, they saw something extraordinary. The Mongol camp was lifting its tents. They were withdrawing. Park could not believe it. He thought it was a trap. But hour after hour, they watched as the Mongols dismantled. The camp loaded their equipment and began marching north. Sartak had been forced by his own officers to obey Gadai Khan's order. The humiliation of withdrawing without having taken Kuju would haunt him the rest of his career. By noon, the last Mongol had disappeared on the horizon. Park remained on the walls for hours, unable to process what had just happened. His men surrounded him. Someone asked, "Did we win?" Park looked at the shattered walls, the unburied bodies, the emaciated civilians, the wounded soldiers. He answered in a hoarse voice, "We survived. Sometimes that is the same as winning." 73 soldiers and 1,600 civilians had resisted 33 days against 20,000 Mongols. It was impossible, but it had happened. The news of the failure at Kuju reached Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire, 6 weeks after the lifting of the siege. Gadai was reviewing maps of future conquests when he received the report. He read in silence, then read it again. "How many defenders did this fortress have?" he asked. "Approximately 300 at the start, less than 100 at the end." And we lost how many men? More than 3,000 dead? Almost 1,000 wounded? The silence that followed was terrifying. Gudai summoned his most experienced generals and asked them a simple question: how is this possible? The generals studied the tactics Park had employed, the defensive innovations, the use of terrain. What they found worried them deeply. For the first time, an enemy had systematically analyzed Mongol tactics and developed effective countermeasures. Kuju was not just a military defeat, it was a breach in the Mongol myth of invincibility. Gudai made a decision that surprised many. Instead of severely punishing Sartek, he discreetly relieved him of command. Wanted no additional publicity about the failure. But he also ordered that the defenses of Kuju be studied, tactics developed, to overcome similar fortifications in the future. In Korea, the news of Kuju's resistance spread like wildfire. Park had become an instant popular hero. The general was summoned to the royal court 3 months after the siege. He expected honors, recognition. What he received was more complex. The king granted him titles and lands, but also ordered him to retire from active service immediately. The official reason was to rest after his heroic defense. The real reason was political. Park was too popular, and the king did not trust generals who overshadowed his own authority. Park accepted without protest. He had seen enough war. He retired to a small property in the south, where he lived another 18 years before dying in 1249. He never wrote his memoirs, never sought more glory. For the Mongols, Kuju became a costly but valuable lesson. In later campaigns, they implemented new siege tactics based on what they had learned from their failure. They developed more patient strategies, less dependent on massive assaults. Ironically, Park's defenses made the Mongols better at siege warfare. In terms of psychological impact, Kuju had lasting consequences. In the following decades, when the Mongols returned with new demands, they found a population less willing to submit immediately. Resistance seemed possible now. Stardak never regained his prestige. He died in 1241 during a minor campaign without glory. Mongol historians barely mention him. The siege of Kuju cost approximately 3,200 Mongol casualties and 227 military defenders, plus nearly 600 Korean civilians. In purely numerical terms, the Mongols might have considered it acceptable. But in terms of time, resources, and lost prestige, it was a disaster. Because sometimes in war, it is not about who wins, but about who can afford to lose. And the Mongols, accustomed to quick and cheap victories, discovered that there was a price too high even for the most powerful empire in the world. So was the siege of Kuju the worst carnage the Mongols experienced in Korea. Yes, not because the absolute figures were the highest, but because it represented something the Mongols rarely experienced: a complete tactical defeat against a numerically inferior enemy. Why did the defenders win? 3 critical factors. First, exceptional leadership. Park was not a legendary military genius, but he was an adaptable thinker. He constantly innovated, presenting new challenges every day. Second, intelligent use of limited resources. Park understood that he could not win with force, so he won with efficiency. He concentrated forces where it mattered and made taking anything unbearably costly. Third, the Mongols counted on fear-breaking enemy morale. In Kuju, they found defenders who had decided that dying resisting was preferable to living subjugated. That mindset is impossible to defeat with mere military tactics. The lessons of Kuju transcend its time. It demonstrated that great empires are not invincible when facing determination combined with innovation. Park teaches us something about leadership that remains relevant today. A leader does not need to promise victory to inspire his people. Sometimes what is needed is brutal honesty about reality, respect for those he leads, and the will to share every risk he asks them to take. It teaches us that arrogance, even when backed by 20,000 elite warriors, can be defeated by 300 men. With a better plan and nothing to lose, Park Seo's legacy endured in Korean memory for centuries. Today, almost 800 years later, his name remains synonymous with impossible resistance. The Kuju Fortress, though in ruins, is a protected historical site in South Korea. What does this tell us in our time? That facing impossible odds does not mean surrendering before starting. That innovation can level unequal playing fields. That collective determination can achieve what individual resources cannot. The story of the Siege of Kuju is the story of humanity in its rawest form. Vulnerable, but extraordinarily resilient when it finds a cause worth resisting for. 73 men against an empire, and the empire blinked first.